Kirby's God is turning his back on man. Now that's a far cry from the Michelangelo famous image from the Sistine Chapel of God creating man. But Kirby was the Michelangelo of comics. In the 1960s, the amount of Marvel Comics characters he created or co-created with Stan Lee was a veritable cornucopia of creativity. In this vertical image, you can see that he placed Captain America as the leader. He felt Captain America was his favorite character of all the characters that he drew. And you can see how this image, when it's taken down to its black and white form, was what the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles used for their poster when they had a major exhibition in 2006 on comic book art. Now it's starting to happen where museums are having comic art shows. In 1976, Kirby does Captain America's Bicentennial Battles, a large-size treasury edition. In that edition is a double-page spread panel that looks like this. I love it in its pencil form. It's looking a little more abstract. Well, this resembles the cyclorama at Gettysburg, which is a 200-foot-long panorama of the Battle of Gettysburg, and it's mounted in what's called a cyclorama. And I feel that that's echoed in Kirby's work here. A friend of mine, an artist named Andriano, looked at this image and he said, Arlen, I see Picasso's Guernica in it. Because the same sort of violent energy you see in that Picasso Guernica, you can see echoed in Kirby's art. Later on, he does this image for DC Comics about a lineup of World War II refugees getting mowed down by a machine gun. And Kirby, of course, served in World War II under General Patton, and he probably witnessed or knew firsthand about instances like this. Well, how different is this from what Goya did 150 years earlier in one of his most famous paintings of the Franco-Spanish War, in which innocent Spanish civilians are being gunned down by the French. And you can see how that is echoed in Kirby's work as well. And even though Captain America was Kirby's most loved character, the character he felt he was most like was the Thing, because he said the Thing talked like him, moved like him, acted like him. And that's why in my book, in the beginning of the Kirby chapter, I put the Thing's face in there in the portrait section. Kirby's protege in the 1940s was a young artist named Eli Katz, who changed his name to Gil Kane. Gil Kane did, amongst many other characters, the definitive Green Lantern for DC Comics. In this double-page spread for my book, you can see how he, along with all the artists in the 60s, was influenced by the dynamism and the power Kirby was bringing to the superhero art of his time. So while he's at DC, he's trying to echo that power. Then he leaves DC and goes to Marvel in 1967, and the bottom panel, he's actually drawing Captain America for Marvel, and he's echoing perfectly what he learned from Jack Kirby. In my book, I take out the original text and I put in the artist talking about the artwork. So here's Gil Kane saying, if I managed any kind of resemblance to Kirby's work, it was only on the most superficial level, because Kirby's approach is so uniquely his own that I couldn't even begin to duplicate it. Well, my answer to Gil Kane's self-effacement is to say, don't worry, Gil, I think you did a pretty good job. His other character, of course, is the Atom. Once again, comics are words and pictures. So Kane says in the text here, I look to ballet, trampoline, and jumping for my movement. So I give you an image of the Atom jumping on an eraser like a trampoline. Gil Kane also did the first title page in my book because his civilian identity of the Atom, Ray Palmer, looking up to science and technology in 1961 is where America was in the Kennedy years. Looking up, we'll put a man on the moon in 10 years. This image to me encapsulates the early Silver Age. And then I'll show you the image later on in this presentation about the image that captures the end of the Silver Age. After Kirby Kane leaves DC, he tries these other formats to expand comic book art into more areas that became known as the graphic novel. Savage was a very violent, very much like early pre-Clint Eastwood Dirty Harry. Then he creates a sword and sorcery graphic novel called Black Mark. And you can see how he's experimenting with typeset type in Black Mark. He created some of his greatest images in black mark. This must have been a subject matter that really got to Kane. And again, when I look at these images, I see in these a dynamism and a power that you just don't find in classical fine art. I mean, this is by the great Raphael about St. George slaying the dragon. He also did another version of St. George slaying the dragon. But it's interesting, if you look at the sketch that Raphael made of it, in Italian, a sketch was called a cartoon, C-A-R-T-U-N-E. And that's where we get the word cartoon from. You can see in Michelangelo's and Da Vinci's sketches, there's a definitely comic book feel to the figures. Here's a Gil Kane sketch pad where you can see how he fooled around and tried to learn anatomy from the inside out. I find these very much like the classical works of a Da Vinci. There's Da Vinci's Michelangelo's David, Michelangelo's David, perfect human proportions. Well, I consider this image by Neil Adams to be the greatest single image of Superman ever drawn in terms of presenting the perfect human proportion. Adams' figures in the late 60s really revolutionized comic book art because he brought a realism and literally a point of view that had never been seen in comics before. If you think other comic book artists of his day could draw these characters from this angle, good luck. Here's a self-portrait Adams did in 1970, and you can see that Adams drew himself into some of his most famous characters. Once again, try drawing a man crying. Try drawing a man with a mask crying, and not many can pull it off like Neil Adams pulled it off. Green Arrow was one of his characters teamed up with Green Lantern in this famous series in 1970, where they meet this black man on a tenement rooftop. This exchange really features the first realistically drawn black man in the history of comics, with the exception maybe of one other. A lot of people think Adams used photo reference for this image, but he made that up out of his head. He wishes he had photo reference, and that's why panels like this were so convincing, because Adams had the photographic drawing ability to pull off images like this. Later on in the series, Adams gets a chance to literally do Jesus Christ when they did a story ripped from the day's headlines in 1972 about how protesters in Seattle were going against the SST because it would cause too much pollution. So in Green Lantern Green Arrow, they had a story about a Christ-like protester chaining himself to a plane to prevent it from taking off. At the very end, he dies, and his girlfriend, the owner of the aircraft, says, "Oh, I suppose progress must always claim its victims." Here's a perfect example of how Adams can draw an emotion without having any words. You know what Green Lantern feels by the power of his drawing. He destroys the aircraft in one swath of his powering. What's the big idea? It's a $9 million aircraft. Send me a bill. That's the image I use for the second title page in my book, which is to me about the death of the 60s, the end of the counterculture. And it's these two images that bracket my book that tell the story of not only America from the early 60s to the early 70s, but comic books itself. The cover of that groundbreaking story, if we come in a little closer, we see the pencil sketch that Adams made from that, which has a very close look to a sketch Rembrandt did of the crucifixion. You could see a classical feeling in another piece of Adams' art using these superheroes of DC Comics, which he said was influenced by not a classical painter, but the great illustrator Norman Rockwell, when he did this ad that appeared in the Saturday Evening Post. And the expression that they use from Lord Byron underneath says, "Parent of golden dreams, romance, auspicious queen of childish joys, who leads along in airy dance the votive train of girls and boys." That could just as well be said about comic books and superheroes as Byron meant it about romance. Adams used that image really just as the backdrop for a December calendar page in the 1976 DC Comics calendar. One of Adams' most famous images is this lineup of characters that influenced a 7-year-old Alex Ross to later on do his comic book lineups of superheroes. which were also influenced by, once again, the great Norman Rockwell's realism. You look at an Alex Ross image looks like this, that he used for a 9/11 memorial cover, and you can see the Rockwell influence. Look at this Alex Ross Marvel Comics character's profile image, and there you have a Norman Rockwell. Rockwell himself was not considered a fine artist in the same way comic artists today are not considered fine artists, because the painters of the day thought he was just an illustrator. And an artist like Jackson Pollock, that Norman Rockwell paints there in homage, is a real artist. Well, there's Norman Rockwell in his, Jackson Pollock in his studio in the 1950s painting with his splattered paint, and there's Rockwell imitating him exactly, doing an exact Jackson Pollock imitation that he then uses in his painting to poke at the idea that, hey, we're all artists making images. There should be no distinction between fine art and illustration. Mobius, the great French comic artist, kind of did his take on that Rockwell image and on the notion between gallery art and comic art. There's Mobius himself, before he died a few years ago, in the gallery hanging the work. And you can see the influence from the Norman Rockwell. I found this image on the internet that actually uses an AirSats Neil Adams Superman. That's not the actual Neil Adams Superman. It's taken from this double-page spread panel. It always goes to show you that the art that fine artists make of comics is never quite as great as the original comic art itself, which brings up the idea of what have the museums been doing about comics? Well, they've never had an all-comic show. They would have shows like this, Comic Abstraction, that would show how fine artists like the great Keith Haring would take a comic book attitude to their work. Or Comic Abstraction. You've got artists like this. This is a current artist named Sigmund Polk doing a sort of a mashup of Superman in the supermarket. That's actually lettering from Mad Magazine. Here's what the Museum of Modern Art show looked like. And believe it or not, those things on top there, those are actually supposed to be three-dimensional word balloons with the little pointers that hold them to show how fine artists are using comic art. Well, we've never really had a comic art museum in this country. This museum no longer exists, but it's the Words and Pictures Museum in Northampton, Massachusetts, that was run by one of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle guys, Kevin Eastman. It ran for about 10 years. In 1997, they asked me to create, and they had these 55-inch by 27-inch glass panels. They had 10 of them. They said, Arlen, I had 5 of them, double-sided. They said, Arlen, will you do something on the history of Batman? So I put together a series of giant panels called The Graphic History of Batman that tried to show in words and image form how, for instance, Bob Kane combined influences from Leonardo da Vinci. There's his flying machine, where he said, if you're going to make a flying machine, don't copy the movements of a bird, copy the movements of a bat that Kane claimed influenced his early Batman. But why tell you about these when I can show you in a video I made in 1997 of what the museum actually looked like? It was really a beautiful museum. It's a shame that it's no longer there. It's in Northampton, Massachusetts, where they're set up. And in a weird Abraham Zapruder-like life imitating art, yeah, there's me in 1997 in the reflection in my flowery comic book shirt. Anyway, and that's what it looked like. A year later, I did a similar exhibit called The Art History of Superman, where I did a similar thing, a series of panels. So I've always been trying to get comic book art, the real comic art, into museums, but it's very, very difficult. Now in Europe, on the other hand, they respect and honor their comics. In Belgium, they have a museum of the comic strip. You might know the most famous, that rocket ship comes from Tintin. This isn't just a museum of Tintin art, there's a whole world of the Belgian comic strip. Look how they exhibit their comic art in these rooms. We don't have anything like this in America. In England, there's a bar that looks like this. It's got all the Marvel Comics characters. In Europe, somebody made these sculptures of the Marvel Comics characters, larger than life, Daredevil, and the Silver Surfer. Look at what they're doing in Russia. They took this existing bas relief sculpture, and some vandals painted it over to look like this.
Yeah.
Yeah, baby, revolution. You know, in this country, the closest we have to that is maybe, you know, the balloons in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. But there's a long tradition. Right from the beginning, Superman was a part, right, 1939, his first year out. This is a shot from him in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. This is a shot I found off the internet. I don't know whether this is in America or this might be in Europe. But again, comics and Superman are so much a part of our culture, so you've got Superman abstract imagery as part of this wall. But Superman, again, was part of the culture right from the start. He was emblazoned on World War II bomber jets. There's President Obama in front of some Superman sculpture. And of course, Alex Ross mashed the two in 2008 for this image. In the world of fine art, not just in comic book illustrative art, more artists these days are doing images of superheroes, but not in the dynamic way you would kind of expect them. You have images like this that are actually appearing in fine art galleries. Look at this piece of Batman street art done by this artist to look like it's going literally, it's got the depth, but that's flat sidewalk art. It's interesting the things you find on the internet. I mean, there's an image of Batman done in a kind of a Christian stained glass setting. Speaking of Batman and, you know, that kind of setting, you know, here's an image you find. But, you know, this idea of Batman as a Christ figure was being done by Superman for years. I mean, Alex Ross made it very obvious in this image of the Christ-like aspects of Superman. The recent movie made it overt. For Jor-El so loved the earth, he gave his only begotten son with powers and abilities far beyond those of mortal men. But if Superman is the Christ figure of comics, cannot Batman be one as well? And of course, Alex Ross took this idea and combined the two together into this image for his oversized Superman painted graphic novel. But when you combine the two, you get a kind of a kitschy image like this. And who is the king of kitsch but Jeff Koons? And he's dipped his brush into the comic book vernacular in recent years. And this is the pop art painter Ron English. So you can see how even Mad Magazine is making fun of this sort of more modern interaction between fine art painting and comics. Now, if you look at the bottom right one, you see a takeoff of the famous Salvador Dali surrealist painting, which the great Jim Steranko, who like Neil Adams is also here today, you can go talk to him about this image that he did in December of 1968, one of the great covers of his Nick Fury Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. This came a couple issues after one of the most groundbreaking covers that he did. But to show why this is a work of art is that, like a great work of art, it talks about the past that influenced it. Like this great image by Will Eisner from 1948, 20 years before Steranko's image, you can see echoed in Steranko's 1968 image. If you go in close, you see Steranko was being influenced by Bridget Riley, who was the doyenne of what was called op art. This is a 1965 show at the Museum of Modern Art that really kicked off the op art movement. A couple years later, Steranko was using op art in his S.H.I.E.L.D. art. At the same year, Peter Max was doing his most psychedelic art, which he called his Cosmic series. And he is what most people think of 1968 art in terms of the whole psychedelia. Now, at the same time, of course, Robert Crumb in 1967 and 68 is single-handedly pretty much creating the field of underground comics. And he's dropping acid and doing pages that look like this. Well, it's interesting, the same year that Crumb does this page, Steranko does this page. But unlike Crumb's, in comics you have to have narrative sense and tell the story. So you actually have to turn the page around to read it. Very psychedelic. Well, there was another artist doing psychedelic artwork like Steranko's, and of course, that was Neil Adams with pages like this that ran a couple months after what Steranko was doing. Here's one of Neil's greatest pages that I'll build for you in sequence. It looks like Dead Man is going through this surreal, psychedelic adventure, but when you look closely and squint, you can see Dead Man's face made up in that giant page. I remember I was a 10-year-old kid staring at this cover because no DC Comics artist had ever done what's called a color hold where Dead Man's face is drawn in black but then added to the magenta plate for the printer so that he would print the black line art purely in magenta. And that's why you've got this image. It was the faces by Neal Adams that really made him stand out from the crowd. He even says in my book, you not only saw these superheroes as superheroes, you saw them as human beings. So I would take an image like this, and I would turn it into an image like this when I did one of my first lectures, Superhero to Antihero, that was all about my book 10 years before I got to do and publish my book. So I've always been involved with comic book history. For Print Magazine in 1988, I convinced them to do a special issue on comics. You can see the word comics in there, C-O-M-I-C-S, red, yellow, and blue. And the window panel page design is what I'm trying to get across. I wrote the article on what was happening in superhero comics today, and of course, I used that Superman image that I've now put together in this lecture on art and comic book art, which is being done as a print piece for a forthcoming British anthology comics book called A1. Every issue they like to have a kind of documentary feature. So I took these images and I added text to them, and you'll be able to get this book later this year, but you can see in these double page spreads all the images you've seen today that I do in double page spread print format. So just like my book, you read what the artists have to say about the art and you see the images at the same time. And there's my final, page 11. In my book, I show the relationship between Neal Adams and Jim Steranko, how they were doing the psychedelic art at the same time. If you come to my booth, you'll be able to see me there selling my book. And I'm glad to be here opening up the East Coast Comic Convention. If you happen to be in Guatemala in 3 weeks, I'll be in Guatemala. Actually, they love me in Guatemala, what can I tell you? Upcoming for me next month at the Type Directors Club in Manhattan. What if I told you that the guy who designed the Roman lettering on top of Penn Station, neither snow nor rain nor gloom of night, the guy that designed the Roman lettering on the New York Public Library is the same guy that designed the Superman logo, the Coca-Cola of comic book logos. His name was Ira Schnapp. Nobody knows who he is. Comic book people don't know who he is. But I'll be doing a whole exhibit, and this is the poster that I did. Ira Schnapp did these incredibly beautiful hand-lettered ads in addition to all the logos that DC Comics that you can think of. This comic book was the first comic book I remember seeing as a kid in summer camp. I'm 7 years old. That's the comic book at my feet. So in my book, the last page is a one-page autobiography where I talk about how comic books were my Mount Rushmore. There's me. This is a postcard I sent to my mother from summer camp. By the way, on the internet I found this image, so once again, I'm years ahead of my time. But yeah, that's my idea of Mount Rushmore. And at the bottom, that's me in 8th grade doing an oral report on the lawsuit between Superman and Captain Marvel. And there's me when I had a goatee. A friend, to end this presentation, gave me a saying by Albert Camus, the great existentialist, and he said, Arlen, this phrase is you. And Camus wrote, a man's work is nothing but the slow trek to rediscover through the detours of art those 2 or 3 great and simple images in whose presence his heart first opened. Thank you. Okay, lights up. Believe it or not, we finished right on time. We don't have time for a Q&A, right, everybody? Come see me at my table if you want to talk about that first. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate